So now that we've covered the general overview of the system and how it operates, let's talk about troubleshooting. The most common problem that you have with a system is, the combi oven is going to give you a low water alarm. Now, there's three reasons why you're going to get a low water alarm. One is RO water production, RO water storage, or the combi oven, there's an issue where it's using more water than it should. So we're going to tackle each one of those individually. First, let's tackle the easiest one to diagnose, which is a RO tank storage. So in a scenario where a combi oven gives a low water alarm, say during a cooking cycle, the first thing you need to determine is whether or not this tank is empty or it's full. So a person would go under the counter, lift the tank, and if it's light, it's empty. So that basically means that it's taken all the water out of this tank and the RO is not keeping up with it. If this tank is full and you have a low water alarm, meaning you can pick it up and you can tell that there's about 2 gallons of water in there, so it would weigh, say, 16 pounds, maybe a little bit more, then what's happened is the tank has lost its bladder integrity or its pre-charge. So normally these tanks will have a little Schrader valve and the tank is pre-charged to about 10 psi. At 10 psi, it'll allow this tank to fill up with water and then have pressure on the tank. So when the combi oven calls for water, it's being forced out here. If the bladder is ruptured, you have 0 psi. And what will happen is it will store 2 gallons of water, and then when the combi oven calls for water, it'll only push out maybe a couple ounces. The RO will kick on and start producing water, but then immediately shut down because no water is leaving this tank. So that's the easiest one to diagnose. If that's the case, this tank needs to be replaced. So just to summarize this issue, if you have a low water alarm and this tank is full, then you have a bad tank. And to replace the tank, you're basically going to shut the water off on the inlet, disconnect the tubing from the tank, which we'll talk a little bit more about this tubing connection, get the new tank, put the new valve on, reconnect it, turn it on, let the RO produce water until it fills the tank. So this is the easiest one to diagnose. The other issue that you have is low water production. And there are 3 main components that will cause low water production. One is the booster pump has stopped working and you have low water pressure coming in, so the system's not producing as much water as it should. Now at 60 psi, this system is going to produce, with a new primary cartridge and a new membrane, about 7.5 gallons an hour. With a booster pump, it should actually produce a little bit more. But let's say you have 30 psi, well, maybe 40 psi coming into the building, and the booster pump stops working for some reason, then it's a possibility that the water is not going to replenish the tank fast enough. The way you would know that the booster pump's not working is it's plugged in, and the unit's producing water, but the booster pump isn't humming. It'll allow water to pass through the pump if it's not actually running, but it's not boosting any pressure. The problem could be with the transformer. You can replace the transformer, or it could be with the actual booster pump. But in our experience, it's usually not a booster pump issue. What most likely is the issue is the unit's not producing enough water because the primary cartridge is plugged and needs to be changed. Now, the way we determine that is you can, first of all, check the amount of water production that the unit's producing in a certain period of time to determine if it is possibly this primary cartridge that's plugged. Now, the way that you can check that is, first of all, before you do any servicing, it's best to disconnect the unit from the wall so the booster pump's not running needlessly. Then we would turn off the inlet valve to an off position. We would take the tank valve, turn it off, and we would relieve the pressure on this side of the system by opening up this pressure relief valve. Now, in order to check the amount of water production we have going through the system, we got to disconnect the tank and drain it. Now, in many cases, the tank probably is already empty if the combi oven has a low water alarm, but we're going to have to disconnect the tank, and the way you disconnect the tank is you push in on the collar of this fitting at the same time pulling on the tubing, and the tubing will release. If you do not push the collar of the tubing in, It's like a Chinese finger trap that won't allow the tubing to come out. Sometimes it takes two people to hold the collar in. Sometimes it's easier where you have to push the tubing in and then out, and it will release from the collar. The other issue sometimes is that there's still pressure on the line, and it makes it much more difficult to remove the tubing if there's pressure on the line. So it's always best to turn off the valve, turn on the combi oven, and have it call for water. Then you should be able to remove the tubing as easy as that there. Worst case scenario, if you have slack on the tubing, you can also take a knife or a pair of scissors and cut the tubing about an inch. Make sure it's a nice clean cut. Now the pressure is relieved, you can remove the excess tubing, and then when you go ahead and reconnect it, you can reconnect where you cut. Now once you've disconnected the tank, you can take the tank to a sink, turn it upside down, open the line, and drain the tank. Now the water, if the bladder is good, water will come out of here under pressure and then pretty much abruptly stop when it's fully emptied. With the tank fully emptied, we will hook the tank back up. We will then close our bypass, or excuse me, our pressure relief, plug in the booster pump, and open up the inlet valve. Immediately the unit will start producing water. We're going to run water for say 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever your preference is, but 10 minutes is plenty, and we're talking exactly 10 minutes or exactly 15 minutes. After 10 or 15 minutes, we unplug the booster pump, we turn the water off, relieve the pressure, we close the tank valve. Once again, we relieve the pressure off if needed, but we can disconnect the tubing. And now what we're going to do is we're going to empty the tank, but we're going to measure the amount of water that comes out of that tank. So in a 10-minute cycle, for example, if you emptied the tank and you had a gallon of water out of the tank during that 10-minute cycle, you multiply that times 6 for 60 minutes. That means that you're producing 6 gallons of water per hour. Now the combi oven in almost any cycle is going to use much less than 3 to 4 gallons an hour, even on its most water intensive cooking cycle, full steam. So at 6 gallons an hour, you know that this RO is producing the right amount of water. If it's normally would be producing somewhere around a gallon point, maybe 1 1/4 gallons an hour. So you know if you hit a threshold of 7 or possibly 8, as much as 9 to 10 gallons an hour, we know that the RO is producing the correct amount of water, and we know the tank is storing the correct amount of water, which we'll talk a little bit about in just a second. But let's say that we have an RO that's only producing, say, 3 gallons an hour based on our test, meaning during that 10-minute cycle, say we only got a half a gallon worth of storage. What we can do is hook the RO back up again, or hook the tank back up again by putting in the tubing. We've drained the tank completely already. We're going to open up the tank. Now, if we do not have a separate cartridge that we can replace, we can always take off the primary cartridge by turning it a 1/4 turn counterclockwise until it stops, dropping it out. If you pinch off and you remove the smaller of the 2 O-rings on this cartridge and reinsert the cartridge, and then start the unit up again. Plug it in, turn on the inlet, time it for another exact 10 minutes, unplug it, turn off the line, disconnect the tank, and measure the production. If by simply bypassing the primary cartridge, we're able to get up to another 10 gallons an hour or 7, perhaps 6 gallons an hour, then we know the remedy is simply replacing the primary cartridge. Once you replace the cartridge with a new one, once again, you're going to line up the 2 teeth with the teeth inside the head. Don't have it right there. Here we go. 1/4 turn, it'll lock. At that point, you would be able to put the unit back in service, and you would know that it was the plugged primary cartridge, which was the main reason why the RO was not producing the right amount of water. If you find that the primary cartridge was not the issue, it's most likely the membrane. Now, the primary cartridges are supposed to be changed out quarterly. Membranes are supposed to be changed out yearly, but there are various reasons why a membrane may degrade a little early. But to troubleshoot this, you're going to have to put in a new membrane, which would be simply disconnecting the bottom drain connector, removing the membrane the same way you remove the primary cartridge, putting in a new membrane, reconnecting the drain, and then it should be producing the correct amount of water. But 9 times out of 10, it is a plugged primary cartridge. One last thing is also to determine whether or not the pre-charge in the storage tank is suitable. Perhaps someone put extra pressure in the tank or it lost a little bit of pressure. You can always run the RO until this tank fills up, meaning everything stops. We can disconnect the tank. It will be a heavy tank at that point, but then we can drain the tank into a container and measure the amount of water. Generally, you should have on a full tank 2 gallons of water coming out of the system. So to summarize a little bit about the 2 main reasons why an RO is not going to produce enough water that we've covered so far is you have a storage tank that is waterlogged, it's lost its bladder and it no longer stores water under pressure. Low water alarm, tank is full, it's a tank issue. More commonly, you will have a low water alarm, tank is empty. Now we can look at the primary cartridge as the primary culprit as to why you have a low water alarm on the combi oven. Sometimes simply changing that out, running for 10 minutes, and verifying that you have 7.5 gallons, roughly an hour, being produced, then you know that the system is producing the right amount of water and the unit is storing the right amount of water. If that is verified and there are still low water alarms on the combi oven, there are instances where the combi oven actually has an issue. The 2 that I have seen is bad programming, where a combi oven for some reason has been programmed, and by wiping out the program and reprogramming it, it'll put in the right water usage requirements. But also the combi oven has a humidity sensor which senses how much humidity is in the cabinet, and that humidity sensor determines when to add water for the production of steam. And on occasion, the humidity sensors will fail or be coded and will fail to register humidity, so the combi oven is constantly producing steam. Evidence of this would be on items such as vegetables or rice or something that doesn't require a lot of water, that there is excess moisture in your food product. Sometimes there's excess water inside the combi oven cavity when you open it up. So in other words, you're producing soggy food when you're using too much water, and then on your more intensive cycles like your ribs or your wings, you're running out of water because it's asking for steam continuously when it should only ask for steam periodically. So if you determine that the unit is producing the right amount of water, which should be anywhere between 6 to 10 gallons an hour, which would be acceptable, 7.5 to 8 to 9 is probably a sweet spot. If this is producing the right amount of water per hour and the tank is storing 2 gallons of water, then the issue is not with the RO, the issue is somewhere in the combi.